It was a cold April morning when the body of Selina Hawthorne was found on the side of Willow Street, a desolate road just outside the sleepy town of Pine Hollow. A jogger on his usual route stumbled upon the grisly scene and immediately called the police. The town had never seen anything like it. Murder was something that happened in cities, not in their quiet, close-knit community. Selina, 29 years old and married to a well-known contractor, David Hawthorne, was known by everyone. She was beautiful, charismatic, and lived what seemed to be the perfect life. But appearances could be deceiving, and as investigators began to unravel the mystery behind her death, they discovered a web of secrets and betrayal that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The news of Selina's death spread like wildfire, shattering the illusion of her picture-perfect life. The Hawthornes had been the couple everyone admired: David, the successful businessman, and Selina, the elegant socialite. They attended every event, always hand in hand, the model of what a marriage should be. But as the days went on, whispers began to circulate. Those closest to Selina knew her life wasn't as perfect as it seemed. She had confided in a few friends about the struggles she faced behind closed doors. David was possessive, controlling. Selina had grown distant over the past year, seeking solace in relationships outside of her marriage. It was a dangerous game she had been playing, and now it had caught up to her. Detective Lucas Grant was the first to arrive at the scene. Willow Street was isolated, a forgotten stretch of road that rarely saw traffic. Selina's car was parked on the shoulder, the door ajar, and her body lay just a few feet away. There was no sign of a struggle, no immediate clues as to what had happened. The gunshot wound to her head was the most obvious sign of foul play, but there were no shell casings, no weapon in sight. Detective Grant quickly realized this wouldn't be a simple case. Whoever had done this had taken care to cover their tracks. But as Grant looked around, he had a sinking feeling someone wanted this to look like a random attack, but it felt personal. David Hawthorne was devastated when the police informed him of his wife's death. At least, that's how it appeared. He fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, unable to process the news. Detective Grant was there, observing closely. Something about David's reaction didn't sit right with him. It felt rehearsed, too polished. But grief was unpredictable, and Grant knew better than to jump to conclusions. David was brought in for questioning, and he played the role of the grieving husband perfectly. He spoke of his love for Selina, their plans for the future, and how he couldn't imagine life without her. But underneath the surface, there was something off. Grant wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. The investigation into Selina's death kicked into high gear. Detectives combed through her life, looking for anything that could explain what had happened. Her phone was the first piece of evidence to be scrutinized, and it revealed more than anyone had expected. Text messages, hidden conversations, and secret accounts all pointed to one thing: Selina had been having affairs. Not one, but three. The men were all different: Josh, a mechanic; Kyle, a barista; and Marcus, a wealthy businessman. It became clear that Selina's life was far more complicated than anyone had known. Her affairs weren't just casual flings, they were a means of escape from her controlling husband. As detectives dug deeper into Selina's marriage, they began to uncover the darker side of her relationship with David. Friends of Selina came forward, describing a man who was controlling and possessive, a husband who watched her every move. Selina had confided in a few close friends, telling them that David's jealousy had grown over the years. He was obsessed with her, one friend told Detective Grant. He didn't let her breathe. She had to report where she was at all times. It was suffocating. Selina had been planning to leave David, the friend revealed. She had mentioned it just weeks before her death. Could David have found out about her affairs? And if so, did that knowledge push him to murder? With the knowledge of Selina's affairs out in the open, the police turned their attention to the men she had been involved with. Josh, Kyle, and Marcus were all questioned, each man revealing a different side of Selena's life. Josh described her as vulnerable, someone who needed to be loved and appreciated. Kyle spoke of their deep conversations and how she had confided in him about her unhappy marriage. Marcus, the wealthiest of the three, painted a different picture. He described Selena as a woman who wanted excitement and adventure, someone who was tired of her mundane life. But none of the men had an alibi for the night of her murder. Any one of them could have been involved. As the investigation continued, the town of Pine Hollow became divided. Some believed that David was innocent, that he could never have hurt Selena. After all, he was a respected man, someone who had given so much to the community. But others weren't so sure. Rumors of his controlling behavior, his jealousy, and his obsession with Selena began to spread. Everyone knew David was too possessive, a neighbor said. He couldn't handle the idea of relieving him. The police were left with more questions than answers. Was this the result of a jealous husband pushed to the brink? Or was one of Selena's lovers responsible for her death? As Detective Grant sifted through the evidence, he began to piece together a clearer picture of Selena's final days. The text messages she had exchanged with her lovers painted a story of a woman who was desperate to escape her marriage. But more than that, Selena had grown fearful. In the days leading up to her death, she had sent cryptic messages to her friends, expressing concerns about her safety. "He's watching me," she wrote in one message. "I can't shake the feeling that something terrible is going to happen." The messages were chilling, and they pointed to David, but there was still no hard evidence linking him to the crime. Grant knew he needed more if he was going to make an arrest. As the investigation progressed, the police received a tip about a gun that had been sold to David Hawthorne just a few months before Selena's death. David had purchased the firearm legally, but it had never been reported missing. The gun was still unaccounted for, and the police had no idea where it could be. The missing gun became the focal point of the investigation. If the police could find it, they might be able to tie David to the murder. But for now, it remained elusive. The detectives searched David's property, combing through his house and yard, but the gun was nowhere to be found. As more details of Selena's life came to light, her friends began to speak out. They described a woman who had been living in fear for months, afraid of what David might do if he found out about her affairs. One friend, Claire, had been especially close to Selena in the final weeks of her life. She was scared, Claire told Detective Grant. She said David had started following her, checking her phone, and questioning her every move. She was planning to leave him, but she didn't know how. Claire's testimony was damning, but it still wasn't enough to prove that David had killed Selena. The detectives needed something more concrete. In the weeks following Selena's death, David's behavior began to change. At first, he had appeared distraught, playing the role of the grieving husband perfectly. But as time went on, he became more withdrawn, avoiding the police and isolating himself from the community. Detective Grant took note of David's shift in demeanor. It was as if the man was crumbling under the weight of his guilt. But without concrete evidence, there was little the police could do. They continued to monitor David's movements, hoping that he might slip up and reveal something incriminating. One piece of evidence that came to light during the investigation was a GPS tracker that had been placed on Selena's car. The device had been installed months before her death, and while Selena had never mentioned it to her friends, the police suspected that David was behind it. David denied any involvement with the tracker, but Detective Grant wasn't convinced. The tracker suggested a level of obsession and control that fit with the other evidence they had gathered. But again, it wasn't enough. Grant needed to find a way to link David to the murder definitively. Piecing together Selena's movements on the night of her death became crucial to understanding what had happened. The last time anyone had seen her alive was at a local cafe, where she had been having drinks with Claire and another friend. She had seemed tense, distracted, and had left early, claiming she needed to clear her head. After leaving the cafe, Selena had driven toward Willow Street. But why? There was nothing out there, no houses, no businesses. It was a mystery that continued to baffle the investigators. Had she gone there to meet someone? Or had someone forced her to go? The investigation took a dramatic turn when the missing gun was finally located. It had been discovered buried in a remote area of David's property, hidden under layers of dirt and debris. The gun, a match for the type used in Selena's murder, was the breakthrough the police had been waiting for. Detective Grant immediately had the gun tested for fingerprints and DNA. If David's prints were on the weapon, it would be the final nail in the coffin. But when the results came back, they were inconclusive. No prints, no clear evidence. The police were left with more questions. Just when it seemed the case was at a standstill, a new lead emerged. One of Selena's former co-workers came forward with information that shook the investigation. She claimed that Selena had confided in her about a plan to meet one of her lovers on the night of her death. The co-worker didn't know which lover it was, but the revelation opened up a new possibility. Had Selena been meeting one of the men she had been involved with? Could one of them have killed her in a fit of jealousy or anger? The police began to investigate the men again, questioning them more thoroughly and looking for any inconsistencies in their stories. Detective Grant focused on the three men Selena had been involved with. Josh, Kyle, and Marcus were all questioned again, and their alibis were scrutinized more closely this time. Josh had been at a friend's house the night of Selena's death, but his alibi was shaky. Kyle had been at work, but no one could confirm his exact whereabouts after his shift ended. Marcus had been out of town on business, but Detective Grant wasn't ready to rule him out just yet. Each man had a motive, and each had a reason to want Selena dead. The question was which one of them had acted on it. One morning, the police station received an anonymous tip that threw the case into chaos. The caller claimed to have seen Selena arguing with a man the night she was killed. The description was vague, but it matched one of the men she had been involved with, Josh. Detective Grant immediately brought Josh in for questioning. Josh maintained his innocence, insisting that he hadn't seen Selena in weeks. But the tip was hard to ignore, and the police began digging into his past. They discovered a history of violent behavior, particularly in relationships. Could Josh have killed Selena in a fit of rage? As the investigation into Josh deepened, another unexpected twist occurred. A neighbor of David's came forward, claiming to have seen David leave his house late on the night of Selena's murder. The neighbor hadn't thought much of it at the time, but with the case still unsolved, she had decided to come forward with the information. This new lead put David back in the spotlight. The police had been focusing on Selena's lovers, but now it seemed that David was more involved than they had initially thought. The detectives began to look more closely at his alibi, and cracks started to appear. David's calm demeanor began to crumble under the pressure of the investigation. He had maintained his innocence from the beginning, but the police weren't buying it. His story didn't add up, and the more they dug, the more suspicious he became. Detective Grant focused on David's behavior in the days leading up to Selena's death. There were signs of mounting tension between them, fights, arguments, and a growing sense of paranoia on David's part. He had suspected Selena of cheating, but had he known the full extent of her affairs? As the investigation continued, another man entered the picture, someone completely unexpected. A local man named Nathan, who had once worked for David, came forward with new information. Nathan claimed that David had confided in him months earlier, expressing his frustration and jealousy over Selena's behavior. Nathan's account painted a picture of a man on the edge, someone who felt betrayed and humiliated by his wife's actions. The police were intrigued by this new lead, but they still needed concrete evidence to link David to the crime. Selena's phone records revealed something even more chilling. On the night of her murder, there had been a series of calls made to an unknown number one that the police traced back to a burner phone. The number wasn't registered to anyone, but the calls had been made in the vicinity of David's house. This new discovery pointed to premeditation. Whoever had been using the burner phone had been planning Selena's murder for some time. But was it David? Or could it have been one of her lovers? The detectives were determined to find out. As David's alibi fell apart, the police grew more suspicious. David had claimed to be home the night Selena was murdered, but new evidence suggested otherwise. Surveillance footage from a gas station near Willow Street showed a car matching David's leaving the area just minutes before Selena's estimated time of death. Confronted with this evidence, David struggled to explain it away. He insisted that he had nothing to do with Selena's murder, but the police weren't convinced. The noose was tightening around David, and he knew it. As the investigation deepened, David's involvement in Selena's death became more apparent. Selena's affair with Marcus had been her most serious, and David had known about it long before her murder. The police uncovered emails between David and Marcus, where David had threatened to expose the affair publicly. This new information shifted the focus back to David. He had been obsessed with controlling Selena, and the affair with Marcus had been the final straw. The police believed that David had planned the murder in response to the humiliation he felt. As part of the investigation, a psychological profile of David was developed. The profile painted a picture of a man with deep-seated insecurities, someone who had been driven to the brink by his wife's infidelity. David had always been possessive of Selena, but her affairs had pushed him over the edge. The profile suggested that David had killed Selena not out of hatred, but out of a desperate need to regain control. He couldn't stand the thought of losing her to another man, so he had made the ultimate decision to end her life. As the police gathered more evidence, they realized that David's decision to kill Selena had been premeditated. He had spent weeks planning the murder, carefully covering his tracks and making sure that no one would suspect him. But despite his meticulous planning, David had made mistakes that the police were now using to build their case. One of the key pieces of evidence was the burner phone. David had purchased it under a fake name, but the police had traced the phone's movements to locations that corresponded with David's known whereabouts. It was a crucial link that would ultimately tie him to the crime. With the mounting evidence against him, the police finally obtained an arrest warrant for David. It had taken months of investigation, but Detective Grant was confident that they had enough to convict him. David was taken into custody without incident, his once pristine reputation now in tatters. The arrest sent shockwaves through Pine Hollow. David had been a respected figure in the community, but now he was being accused of murdering his wife. The media descended on the town, turning the case into a national sensation. As David awaited trial, the media frenzy surrounding the case reached new heights. Journalists from across the country flocked to Pine Hollow, eager to cover every detail of the unfolding drama. David's face was plastered on the front page of every newspaper, and the story of his marriage to Selena became the subject of endless speculation. Some people still believed that David was innocent, that he had been framed by one of Selena's lovers, but others were convinced of his guilt, pointing to the overwhelming evidence that the police had gathered. The town was divided and everyone had an opinion on what had happened. The trial of David Hawthorne began on a crisp fall morning. The courtroom was packed with spectators, all eager to see how the case would unfold. The prosecution wasted no time in laying out their case, presenting the jury with the mountain of evidence they had gathered. They painted a picture of a man consumed by jealousy and rage, someone who had been driven to murder by his need for control. The prosecution detailed the events leading up to Selina's death, showing how David had carefully planned the murder and tried to cover his tracks. David's defense team tried to paint a different picture. They argued that David had been pushed to the edge by Selina's infidelity, that he had acted in a moment of passion rather than premeditation. They called character witnesses to testify to David's upstanding nature, portraying him as a loving husband who had simply been pushed too far. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They pointed to the evidence of David's careful planning, the burner phone, the missing gun, and the threats he had made to Marcus. This wasn't a crime of passion, they argued. It was a cold-blooded murder. The most damning testimony came from Selina's close friends. They took the stand to describe the controlling behavior David had exhibited throughout their marriage. They told the jury about the times Selina had confided in them, about her fears that David would hurt her if he ever found out about the affairs. Claire, Selina's best friend, gave a particularly emotional testimony. She told me she was scared of him, Claire said through tears. She said if anything happened to her, it would be because of David. David took the stand in his own defense, hoping to sway the jury. He maintained his innocence, claiming that he had nothing to do with Selina's death. He spoke of his love for her, describing how devastated he had been when he found out about her affairs. But under cross-examination, David's story began to unravel. The prosecution grilled him about the burner phone, the missing gun, and the threats he had made to Marcus. David struggled to explain the inconsistencies in his story, and it became clear to the jury that he was hiding something. As the trial drew to a close, both sides made their final arguments. The prosecution urged the jury to focus on the evidence, the burner phone, the missing gun, and the testimony of Selina's friends. They painted a picture of a man who had been driven by jealousy and rage, someone who had planned his wife's murder to regain control over her life. The defense, on the other hand, argued that there was no concrete proof that David had killed Selina. They claimed that one of her lovers could have been responsible, and that the prosecution's case was based on circumstantial evidence. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood to deliver the decision. David sat motionless, his face a mask of indifference. He had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, but deep down he knew what was coming. The jury found David Hawthorne guilty of first-degree murder. The decision was unanimous. David's fate was sealed. As the judge read out his sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, David showed no emotion. He simply stood, turned, and allowed himself to be led away in handcuffs. The town of Pine Hollow was left reeling from the trial. David's conviction shattered the illusion of perfection that had surrounded the Hawthorne family for so long. The once admired businessman was now a convicted murderer, and his wife's tragic death served as a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind even the most polished facades. Selina's family held a private memorial for her, away from the prying eyes of the media. They mourned not only her death, but the years of pain and fear she had endured in her marriage. For them, the trial's conclusion brought some sense of closure, but it could never bring back what they had lost. The news of David's conviction sent shockwaves through Pine Hollow. Some residents struggled to believe that the man they had known for years could be capable of such a horrific crime. Others were less surprised, pointing to the whispers about David's controlling behavior that had been circulating for years. He always had that dark side, one neighbor said. It's just a shame it took something like this for people to see it. As the town tried to move forward, the case became a constant topic of conversation. Everyone had an opinion, and the lines between guilt and innocence blurred in the court of public opinion. Though Selina's life had been cut tragically short, her legacy lived on in the hearts of those who had loved her. Her friends and family remembered her as a vibrant, compassionate woman who had been trapped in a marriage that had drained her spirit. They spoke out about the dangers of control and jealousy, hoping that Selena's story would serve as a cautionary tale. Claire, in particular, became an advocate for victims of domestic violence. She started a support group in Selena's name, helping women who were struggling in their own relationships to find the strength to leave before it was too late. David adjusted to life behind bars, though he never fully accepted his fate. He spent his days in solitary contemplation, replaying the events that had led to his downfall. Though he had been convicted of the crime, he maintained his innocence to anyone who would listen. But as the years went by, fewer and fewer people cared. The world outside moved on, and David was left to reflect on the choices he had made. His obsession with control had cost him everything: his wife, his freedom, and his future. Though David had been convicted, questions still lingered in the minds of some. Was there more to Selena's death than what had been revealed at trial? Could one of her lovers have played a role in her murder? The police had been thorough in their investigation, but no case is ever without its mysteries. For Detective Grant, the case was closed. But he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something missing, some detail that had slipped through the cracks. He had spent months unraveling the truth, but even the most airtight cases leave room for doubt. As David sat in his prison cell, the weight of his actions pressed down on him. He had lost everything: his wife, his freedom, his future. In trying to control Selena, he had destroyed both their lives. And now, all he could do was sit and reflect on the ruin he had made of his world.